Should I just start? Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm really excited to introduce our Pollster panel here today. My name is Avi Agarwal. I'm a junior studying government and economics from Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm honored to introduce our amazing panelists here today. Starting with Mr. Ken Goldstein, a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco and one of the country's premier experts on the use and impact of political advertising. He also consulted for ABC as a member of their election night decision team. He was also a co-founder of the Big Ten Battleground Poll, a study of political attitudes in 8 Midwestern states. Lastly, he developed an addiction to black coffee during his coverage of the 2004 election. Next, we have Mr. Robert Cahaly, the founder of the Trafalgar Group, one of the nation's most prominent polling firms. Notably, they predicted a 2016 Trump Electoral College victory to spur a large consensus otherwise by increasing the weighting of shy pro-Trump voters. Trafalgar was also most accurate in several races in following elections. And lastly, Mr. Cahaly is also a longtime fan of the Dallas Cowboys, not enjoying their current 1-2 record. Next, we have Mrs. Natalie Jackson, the Vice President of GQR, where she has conducted an election polling in all types of races and has worked with congressional and Senate campaigns, including Senate Majority PAC. She writes the leading indicator columns for the National Journal and also has led polling teams at Just Capital, the Huffington Post, and Marist College. She also runs a Substack called Herding Cats and Polls, exploring how politicians, the mass public, and cats are all alike. Next, we have Mr. Mark Penn, who is the president and managing partner of the Stagwell Group. He's the co-director of the Harvard Caps and Harris poll and chief strategist in many political campaigns domestically and globally, notably to Hillary Clinton in their Senate campaigns and 2008 presidential campaign. He was also the White House pollster to President Bill Clinton and was a key advisor in the 1996 re-election, identifying soccer moms as the key swing vote. And lastly, he is a member of Harvard's best house, Leverett House, just like me. And lastly, moderating our panel today, we have Mrs. Mia Costa, a professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth. She has several publications in peer-reviewed journals, such as the American Journal of Political Science, and recently she published a book, How Politicians Polarize, on the implications of an us versus them politics for American democracy. Lastly, she's a self-described weekly loser of the New Yorker Caption Contest. I hope you guys are all excited to hear from our extremely talented panelists, as I am, especially of how tired they are of explaining what margin of error means to the general public. Thank you.
Thank you. That was such a good introduction. I have the privilege of talking about like the really sexy topics of like the technicalities of weighting and modeling. So I was going to start somewhere else, but since he mentioned it, I actually want to just jump right in and ask a question that maybe Rob can start with, and then this can be, of course, a question for anyone. But it just mentioned that at the Trafalgar Group, you are sort of well known in this last election for thinking about the shy Trump voter. And so I kind of want to invite you all to discuss to kind of critique your own profession and think about like what are pollsters getting wrong. And Rob, I wanted to start with you because you've been on record saying that there's a lot of missing the mark lately from a lot of other pollsters, and maybe not the Trafalgar Group, and that maybe the Trafalgar Group is getting it right. And so my question is what are you getting right, and what are others getting wrong? Is it a matter of doing a better job at getting Trump voters to answer your polls? Or is it something else? And sort of what has been the challenge for yourself or for others, and specifically in thinking about this last year?
Well, most specifically, the criticism that I had was a lot more in 16 and 20 than in 24. I feel like there was a lot of catching up, and people were doing a better job of getting to those voters, those kind of, you've got two different groups here. You have low propensity voters who kind of just turn out to vote for Trump, and then you have shy Trump voters who are people who don't really want to admit they're voting for Trump, and you have to really kind of work to kind of get them there, and a lot of that, we'll move the shy voters first. A lot of that involves anonymity. they have really got to be genuinely convinced nobody is making a record of this data. That's one of the key things you have to do. And there are all kind of ways to do that. I'm not going to give every little secret we have on doing that, but it's really important now that low propensities are a different group. And we actually started that in 2016 in the primaries when we were hearing stories of people turning out to vote who'd never voted in a voting machine, who didn't understand anything. And it's like these people hadn't voted in years. And this was in the Republican primaries in 2 or 3 of the southern states. And I'm hearing these stories. I'm like, there's something going on. There's something different. And so we started looking at what those people looked like that were coming out of the woodwork. And we built this huge thing. I mean, it had, I think it was 43 different factors. I mean, having a fishing license was one of the factors that made you more likely to fit in this crowd. I mean, and so what we did is we went through in the general election and we included that group in our sampling, going deeper than just people who had voted, in certain patterns of general elections and certain demographic patterns, but looking at people who had been dormant for a long time, who fit a set of factors. So identifying those people. Now that Trump has been on the ballot 3 times, they're easier to find. The challenge for the Republicans is they don't tend to vote in other elections. I mean, believe you me, from everything I heard, the Republicans spent every nickel they had and tons of money in Wisconsin and could not turn them out again. So it is a challenge to turn those voters out, and it's a challenge to poll them. But the shy voters, it's a different type of challenge. But the one thing that I will tell you, and this kind of goes against a lot of polling orthodoxy, and I understand this, but the number one question we always get is, how long is this going to take? And so people only have so much time. So we find that you miss a lot of busy people with a lot of things going on in their life when they're staring down a 20, 30 question poll. If you can tell them 3 or 4 questions, you'll be done in 5 minutes. Even if it lasts 7 minutes, they're hanging on. But it is about getting a busy person to do some, who has a low, political efficacy to participate in a poll. And I'm a big believer in big samples, but short questionnaires to help get that part done.
So I'll jump in here next. I think you can't really divorce the kind of errors that we've seen in polls with Trump from 2 other huge trends that have been going on at the same time. One is education polarization. And the dirty little secret is we've all known all along, everybody who ever works in polling always knew that there are people who just don't answer us, and they are disproportionately not college educated. However, it used to kind of balance out politically, right? Because the groups were not super polarized. Now with the continued polarization and 2016 really kind of locking that in, we saw a much larger political shift, and that's why you saw the discussions of, we need to wait on education. Some people had been doing that, some hadn't, because it simply hadn't been a necessary thing. The other trend is that at the same time, I started polling in 2006. We were still calling landlines. We still had great response rates. The field has shifted so fast. Like, for those of you who are young in this room, I cannot convey to you how fast polling has moved in the last 20 years. We've seen the concept of random digit dialing completely die. I mean, very, very few people, basically no public pollsters in the 2024 cycle doing horse race were doing random digit dial. It was a voter file, panels, et cetera, and there is no gold standard anymore. There are things that are better than others. There are people that are better at this than others. But we're all operating a bit in the wild, wild west of how we contact people and how we get them to respond to polls. So all of that falls together with the Trump-specific phenomenon, and it makes it different. And like now we're looking at 2026, we're designing our models now. Like, are the Republicans going to figure out how to activate these people to vote in a midterm? They haven't yet. We'll see if they do now.
If you want to add, feel free. Otherwise, I can. Sure. So to follow up on that, so Natalie, you mentioned there's like the Trump-specific questions, but then there are these more evergreen debates in polling about like likely voter models and like sampling and like whether we should wait to education or to how someone has voted in the last election. How much do you all see some of those questions enduring, or is that like what will just go away once like Trump is not on the ballot anymore? Like how much of this is like a Trump, phenomenon and like myopic, or how much would you guys be myopic about some of those debates, or how much are those questions that you're going to continue to grapple with like for next time?
Well, can I go back? I was going to answer look, I just want to, the phenomenon of well, let me say, the effectiveness of polling depends upon freedom of speech and thought. And in any society where freedom and speech or thought are curtailed, just throw your poll out the window, because people are telling you whatever opinion will not get them arrested or in trouble or what have you. And I've polled in probably 50 countries. Here on we're no longer on the up-and-coming panel. We're on the older panel, the older and established panel, not the over-the-hill panel, which is the next one. But I would say that, so you got to realize the phenomenon of Trump voters is a result of the stigmatization of voting for Trump. And there is a clear stigmatization of that. And so you'll find that same phenomenon anytime there is a stigmatization. So it may be about Trump voters today, it may be about 5 other topics tomorrow, but you're always looking out for that problem in polling. And I think, I could go back and give you 1 or 2 examples, but I've seen 1 or 2 examples where I threw out the poll because I knew that people were not giving the realistic answer of what they were going to do even the following day. Because when the media frenzy gets too great, then people clam up. And so it is incredibly important for us to be effective in polling for that not to happen. Now, I've seen polling go from in-person to phone to internet and to random digit dial and to panels, and I have gone with the flow. The most fascinating thing to me now is are the panels and online, and I like actually very long questionnaires because I think that you get nothing from a question. I think it's understanding kind of the conception of what's driving people's opinions that give you the analysis, that give you the answer, as opposed to what they say to any question. But I'm intrigued now that we're going to take an AI agent, we're going to go back to random digit dialing. The agent is really going to understand every response that people make, even give them the opportunities to give open-ended responses, and maybe we'll reestablish true random polling again at a low cost through incredible AI agents, which we're already developing.
Yeah, let me jump in here maybe on that. I'm not sure about the notion of the shy Trump voter. And in fact, just saying the words shy and Trump seem sort of odd. It's definitely clear, right? You need, a level of free speech to be able to do a poll. I always thought, I do some election night work, and although I probably would not have been welcome and would not have wanted to go to Damascus 15 years ago, I would have thought that would have been a great gig to be like the election night decision team for Hafez al-Assad. Right? You probably weren't going to get that. You probably weren't going to get that too wrong. I see people much less likely to lie than to simply not do the poll. Now, concerns about privacy could also be the reason why they're not doing the survey in the first place. But if people have low education, which Natalie says, which we've always known is the single greatest variable in people responding to a survey, and some people didn't wait for education, which I always thought was crazy. And so, yeah, and if you didn't, you'd have 55, 60, 65% of your sample with a college education. So the difficulty now is, listen, everybody who's doing work, no matter the methodology, I mean, you talked about how the world has changed from there's no RDD. I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever done a systematic analysis now, but it's also the death of probability polling. There's very, very little probability polling now. I do a mix and much more non-prob than prob at this point, and so everyone's doing heavy weighting. And where I've seen polls go astray is weighting can fix not having enough of a group. It can't fix if the group you're getting is different. So I've actually seen weighting when people say, listen, I always say there's two sorts of pollsters, right? Those who wait to party ID and tell you, and those who wait to party ID and don't tell you. Pollsters I can see like looking down out there. So you may up the number of Republicans, but if you're not getting Republicans who are Trumpy enough, you're actually making it worse. Latinos is a great example, which I think also explains some mistakes in polling, right? You're getting people who are self-identified Latino, and if they're self-identifying as Latino, they're going to be much more likely, on an initial question, they're much more likely to be Democratic, and then you up that number because you're not getting enough Latinos in your survey. So I don't know if this is a satisfying answer, but it's really complicated, and the non-response is this differential non-response, and our statistical tools are created to fix not having enough of a group and can't do a lot if a particular group that we're getting is really different, and we might even exacerbate things.
That's a great point. You mentioned, so some of the problem might be the sampling and the recruiting, but some is also that people lie in surveys and you don't really entirely know what you're measuring. So just wanted to follow up on that and ask about ways to reduce that type of response bias or measurement error, and specifically, like, you know, especially now with like how much polarization has increased and how much the Trump vote is stigmatized, but also really, like enthusiastic in many ways, for lack of a better word. There's so much expressive responding in surveys, I think, or at least there's a lot of research on expressive responding and how people, answer one question and really are talking about something else or expressing their support or opposition to Trump, and that comes out in like other types of sentiment questions. So just wondering from your perspective, perspectives as pollsters, like how do you think about that, and what do we do about that?
So first I want to say one thing about the stigmatization of the Trump vote. Thinking that it's stigmatized is only a thing on the East Coast. If you get out into the rest of the country, like I'm from Texas, specifically rural Texas, but I spend considerable time in Texas, nobody is ashamed that they voted for Trump. Like there are huge, huge swaths of this country where that is a source of pride. And so I think it's important to call that out and remember that in this room where we're a lot from similar backgrounds and live in similar places. Because that's one of the critical things that gets us in trouble as consultants and analysts is when we fail to consider, the full scope of who's out there. Now they may be mad because they feel like media puts them down. But that makes them mad and more open about it and mad at media. And then they just watch Fox News and they self-select other media outlets. And that's part of the whole bifurcation of the media. Anyway, so we weight to all these different things to change our amounts, right? Like Ken said. What we're going to have to do is let go of some of our preconceived notions of what you're supposed to do in polling, right? Like, you're not supposed to wait in the crosstabs. Well, if your crosstab for non-college voters comes back favoring Democrats, are you really going to let that sit? You know it's probably wrong. Are you going to release that data as it is? And that's a big question for public pollsters. And that's the world I spend a lot of time working in. I also think there's no real, AI is great. There are some great AI tools being developed. I don't think that's going to solve our problems. It's certainly not going to bring back probability polling because people are not going to respond to an AI bot for the same tech trust issues that they don't respond to humans because they don't trust them either. So I think it's going to continue to be a very, very complicated space.
Well, one of the things you run into when you're talking about weighting is this idea of, like you said before, that you're waiting. The problem's already occurred. You've missed a segment of people, and so all the waiting in the world isn't going to help if you just didn't get a group of people. I give a lot of speeches about polling, and one of the first things I ask is, how many people in the room, yourselves or anybody you know someone under 50 who's going to answer the phone verbally from a number they don't know? Raise your hands. All right. Well, we're weird. We're here. I get it. This is a nerd convention. I'm surprised we hadn't started talking about Star Trek yet. I'll be glad to talk about it first. But the fact is, almost nobody raises their hand. So my question starts being, well, who are they talking to? And sometimes when you're trying so hard to get people not the way that they need to be reached, you're talking to people who are on extreme on the left, extreme on the right, for God forbid, just bored. And you run into a lot of that. And so that's one of the changes we've seen as we've watched. I mean, the talk about how this has changed so much, it's so radically changing. But we found that text is just a powerful tool. We prefer the text that's not text to link, but text each question one after the other, because a lot of savvy people, you'll lose a whole different group who won't click a link from somebody they don't know. Okay, but most people aren't afraid to send B. A, get served the next question. C, and that gives them a sense of anonymity. But and going back a little bit to the shy vote, it is manifested in different ways. From what it was in 2016. By the time we got to 2020 and really 2024, it was, who are you doing this for? Who gets to see this? What's this stuff? I mean, we actually have something on our website where we explain that the first thing we do on any list is delete all the names. And we guarantee people that your data's not going to be sold. We delete all the names. This is just to get accurate numbers. But people, they're skeptical. They want to know who's asking. They don't want to be on a list. And, they're very nervous, and especially as we talk about a lot of the Trump voters, they're very scared of big government. I mean, we know that. So it is a matter of trying to get people in a way where they are, in a way that seems anonymous enough that you're going to get the honesty that you need. Going back to what Mr. Penn said, I mean, this is really this idea of people being punished for their beliefs is a big thing. And, it may shift the other way with some perceptions of things that are going on right now. But it is, the one thing I'll say is for all of the people who put out public polls, people can criticize, but hats off to you for being in the damn arena and putting your work out there and facing the scrutiny of getting it wrong or right. So I've got very little criticism for anybody who puts out public polls, especially close to an election, and is one to be judged. And I'll take my hat off to all of them.
And that's why I think people, it's kind of interesting. because, you know, when I was actually doing this in a presidential race, I would never have done a call on the basis of a single poll. I had polls in 35 states. I had national polls, daily samples. I had a model of the Electoral College. I had a model of turnout for every state. And I had the resources at which, you know, on the last flight on Air Force One before the election, I had to conclude that Ralph Nader in California was going to get enough votes so that President Clinton would not get 50, but 49. And I had to, unfortunately, tell him after the Macarena that that's where I thought it was going to come out, okay? And I don't think people understand the level of real resources that's really required to actually answer the $3 billion question of who is going to win and who is going to lose. And now people think, well, just go to the poly markets, right? Forget the polls altogether. And of course, just like polls, they will sometimes be right and they will sometimes be wrong. But I try to avoid doing the call until, and you know what I had to do with those 4 different models? I had to reconcile the 4 models. I had to make sure that every state vote and every prediction of turnout and every number of voters that I thought was actually going to reconcile to the master turnout. And when it didn't reconcile, I had to go back to understand why it didn't reconcile. And so when I look at what I call armchair analysis from an individual poll, I laugh. You shouldn't be right, because you don't really have the resources to be right, okay? And let me just say one thing about your comment about weighting political party. I believe in weighting for political party in a series of polls, because we know that statistically it's going to move 4 or 5 points. And we know the single most important variable in political polling is party. That basically, if the Republicans, and so I spent a lot of time estimating and reevaluating, like every 6 months or a year, has political party on the basis of registration and other trends actually changed, in which case you should move it and not let variation in the time series be as a result of, I got 2% more Democrats, because the Democrats are going to be 90% Democrat, the Republicans are going to be 90% Democrat. So the real poll is about the independents, right? And the real poll, I think, in the last election was really about the Latino community. And the Latino community, underneath, the biggest difference between the black and the Latino community was if I asked a black voter, was the economy good? They would say yes. If I asked a Latino voter, they would say no. And so, to me, by looking under that, I would say their economic discontent was the primary driver of their change, because it was so clearly different and out of sorts with all the people who were voting for the Democrat. So I think that's the, kind of analysis and conclusion that I think people have to kind of get into a kind of a deeper level, into these polls. And there's too much, well, the poly markets say they're going to win. There's too much, somebody's done a 2-question poll. You should not only have a result, but you have to have a reason for the result.
So building a little bit on what you said, if one thing you take out of this polling panel, I love an alliteration, is there is no silver bullet, right? You hear a lot of, we're going to do this particular methodology and weight it in this particular way. There absolutely is no silver bullet. And I think not only should you be looking at multiple measures, you should be looking at multiple methodologies and often blending those in a single study. What's interesting is I think back on, graduate school, and someone in the room who I went to graduate school with and sat in statistics classes with many years ago, the thought that I would be doing big non-probability samples would have gotten me tossed out of the University of Michigan. Like if I would have said that in my methods prelim, boom, you're done. Now the fact is, a really expensive probability study is now going to have a 1% response rate, right, or a 2% response rate. So the notion, if that, right, that's a good one. And so, listen, you don't have to put all your poker chips on one, but I think you asked a question about questions, so I'll uncharacteristically answer it. there's lots of different ways of sampling, both in the list you're getting and the mode that you're doing it. Learning how to write questions, I think, is certainly not a skill we teach, and I think probably the only way to do it is just to write a lot of questions over your life. Sorry, I didn't mean to just say write a lot of questions when I looked at you. I'll look at you've probably written some questions as well, not as many as him. And also understanding that when we write the question, that is not necessarily what a normal person is hearing. Now, you all seem like lovely people. You are not normal. And some of you are really not normal. Okay, normal people don't think about this stuff, talk about this stuff, spend 5 hours on a Friday morning in their head, go, you know what, I somewhat disapprove of Donald Trump. Okay, so think about that. So I do think lots of work, lots of thought, lots of pre-testing when you can to make sure that the answer you're getting in a close-ended question is what you think people are answering it. Lastly, and I think it's sort of one thing that's come up here, I just don't think people lie to pollsters. And also interesting about sort of privacy. I mean, listen, he's not going to, but Scott up there in his old life, within 5 minutes, could deliver a targeted ad to each of your phone right now, whether you want it to him or not. And all you young people, you've totally given up privacy. That's just not a thing. So.
Can I just, on the questions, Stephen and I, he just left, teach a course, and we try to build the question. I went to law school, so that was, if you want to learn how to write questions, that was actually a pretty good experience. And one of the things, and in the course, I create a fictional ice cream store, and all the things you would ask about the ice cream store, starting with your favorite flavor. And I find that was really good. That to take something that everybody understood and ask questions about, to kind of learn, how to ask the questions. And the interesting thing, too, that the last point I make about these questions is, and I had this real-life questions because before President Clinton was impeached, the Washington Post ran a question, if President Clinton is impeached, do you think he should resign? Okay, 55% said he should resign. Now, I was polling that for the president, so I knew that was not the answer that I got in my questions. And notice what they have done is they've given you a predictive question. So people are not lying, but people are very bad at predicting what they will believe. And so with Americans, you can get a result to any question. But it doesn't mean when it's predictive that it will be the right result, because he was impeached. And then nobody wanted him to resign. I was able to tell him, nobody wants you to resign. And I had to blast the Washington Post in that particular thing for doing a predictive question in an area like we have a company that does the movies. So every week there are movies, and every week they can check their questions, and every week a number of people show up at the movies and they can refine their models. We didn't have any impeachments. And so when you just decide to ask questions about impeachment because it sounds like a reasonable question to you, you have no experience in that prediction. So you don't really know it's going to be right. And you should always be careful not to kind of take people's predictions of what they will do at face value in circumstances that you have never studied before, because it's hard enough who you're going to vote for us to get that right, even when we've studied that a million times. Because unfortunately, unlike the movies where you get it every week, you only get the elections every 2 to 4 years, and that's our biggest problem.
One very, very quick question note. Pollsters for years have shied away from open-ended responses because they're labor-intensive and they take a long time to deal with. AI has changed that. We can lean in more to open-ended questions, getting people in their own words, and then you need human interaction with the AI. You can't just let it go wild, obviously, but that has just absolutely shifted the paradigm of open-ended questions.
And I wanted to add something about the, people talk about the betting markets. Well, the betting markets often are based on the polling, and the betting markets don't treat every poll the same. I mean, I've seen particular polls come out and move the betting markets. It's one of the reasons I think it's unethical for those of us who are doing those public polls to be involved in the betting markets. But the fact is, if you think for 1 second the betting markets don't reflect some of the polls, and they don't spend their time figuring out which ones they should pay attention to and which ones they shouldn't, that's naive. The betting markets know just what's going on.
Thanks. I want to make sure to leave time for questions, but I did. I think we can all appreciate, and like you said, Ken, we are not normal in this room, so I think we can all appreciate there's no silver bullet and that this is a very complicated science, and that on like the main fundamentals we might agree, but like there have been quite a few actually specific disagreements that I've picked up, like whether we should have short or long questionnaires, whether AI is going to bring back probability polling or not, like how much is are Trump voters shy about or stigmatized. So maybe I'll put it out there, but then I'm not going to have you answer and then I'll ask the audience for questions, because I also think it will be brought up in one of the next panels about communicating polls to the public, because like you said, Mark, like people are bad at predicting like their own future behavior and their own future thoughts, but people are also just bad at lots of things, first of all. But like one of those things is like understanding prediction in general, understanding probability. And so just like what is the role of pollsters to like communicate uncertainty? So I'm going to ask you to not answer just yet. And first we'll maybe collect a question from the audience. But then if you want to touch on that, you can if you want, if there aren't questions. Yes, and please introduce yourself.
I'm Chase Harrison. I'm a survey researcher. So one of the features of kind of current American political thought, especially with Trump voters or certainly populist voters, is a mistrust of credentialed expertise and elites. People who have degrees and who sit in cities and the East Coast typically, and who go out and do data and then say something. And I guess what concerns me, what really keeps me up at night, is that's sort of what we do as pollsters and survey researchers and academics. And how much should I worry about that as I look at declining response rates? Because I can deal with education, but I don't know how to deal with people who don't trust polls if that's correlated with how they vote.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of I'm academically trained, so my default is to think about, the academic research that we have on best practices, and, some of that research used to say, or does say, like, if you're polling from Harvard University, put your name on it because people will be more likely to answer. Well, that's probably not true anymore, or it is for one segment of the population, but it's not for another. And so this is the kind of experimental work that, I know a lot of pollsters are doing, maybe you included, to kind of see what gets people to answer and what doesn't. I'm interested in some work I've seen recently with professional respondents and trying to balance out online professional respondents with a more, random sample from a voter file, say. Because people who are choosing to take surveys are weirdos, right? And I say that as a person who's in survey panels and who does them. So I think, that is a significant part of the ongoing how do we get people to answer question. And I think we need to see more creativity in this, to be honest. And I look forward to, the younger generation helping us think through that, because I think it needs a new lens, and people who are embedded in the new environment. Like, I've never joined TikTok. I'm too old for that at this point. Another social media outlet? No way. But I need my colleagues who are to help me, think through that and figure it out. So that's where I would go with that.
Ken, you had mentioned earlier about the importance of writing questions and how many questions every single one of you or every pollster has written. I'm curious what role, if any, you think AI plays in that now, or does it already play?
That's a good question. I think, listen, if you went, there's various places that'll do it. You could probably get to the 10-yard line with a questionnaire, and it certainly could give you a basic structure. But there is some danger in those last 10 or 15 yards. So I think my answer about the use of AI for writing questions would be my answer for the use of AI in general. You better understand what you're doing when you drive the car. But like for me personally, I'll tell you like the biggest challenge in my survey research career, renumbering. Right, we've all you've literally oh shit, we really should add that question, but then I got to renumber the whole thing, and I can't figure out the Microsoft numbering thing. So AIs solve that sort of thing, but it really can sort of get you to that, I think, 10 or 15 yard line. Where I've also found it useful is in international work, and again, I don't take my English language survey, translate it into another language, and immediately field it. But it's a great basis then for someone who not only really speaks the language, but also understands the culture in the country to look at it.
And I would say, well, you can look it up. We have a product called Harris Quest DIY. So it'll write the survey. It will do the sampling for you. You'll come back in an hour or two, and it will finish the survey, or depending upon how difficult the screen is. And it increasingly will analyze, then give you the analysis. So is that at the 50-yard line or the 10-yard line? I don't know what yard line it is. A lot of it depends upon the complexity of your topic. What does everybody want for lunch today? Probably 100%, right? So I think that again, I always tell people, when I started in surveys, it took 63 people to do a survey. Now it's done with 2 or 3. Now it may be done with 2 or 3 plus 2 or 3 agents, right? I still think the 2 or 3 are there. The good news is I tell people, if you watch Star Trek, the people on the bridge, they're still there, okay? It's the people underneath the bridge, okay? We don't know how many of them, right, really do the survey. Interviewers disappeared, right? And they were the core when I started doing these surveys. But it is going to develop into the next level of technology. We are going to get better, I think, rather than worse. And I do think we're going to look for a way to restore probability because, as Ken said, what I really appreciate about Ken is, yes, we would have been thrown out on our ears if we said, well, we'll just do a representative sample and we'll get enough men and women and college graduates, which is effectively what we're doing out of necessity today. And I don't think we should give up on the quest of randomness.
And so often AIs will go out there and research and make the determination about the questions from a lot of poorly written surveys are part of, what is out there. And so I do agree about that, getting a 10-yard line or so, maybe not even that far, because again, there are probably more poorly written questions published than well-written questions published. So I don't know that AI is there. May be very helpful in the collection. I think that the future's there, but good questions are still going to be written. And when you're putting out a longer survey, you've really got to write them in such a way that help people not tune out. And well-written questions are still key, and I think humans have got to be doing that.
Well, I mean, another thing, how the world has changed, right? So like when I was a graduate student and then, as a young faculty member, I'd be on these national election study committees, right? So you had like one shot at writing the question, and then you didn't want to mess with the time series, and sometimes we get money for a pilot study and, this long process. One of the advantages of us almost being able to do unlimited polling is you can try out different sorts of questions and rigorously experiment and analyze.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panel.